Welcome, I am Daisy, your hostess. We are continuing with the read of the book titled The History of the Devil and the Idea of Evil from the Earliest Times to the Present Day by Paul Carus. This video will contain the chapters on the Inquisition and the Age of Reformation. If you're new to my channel and just found me at this video, please make sure to visit the playlist to grab the previous chapters. And to my family, friends, and subscribers, welcome back. Hopefully you're enjoying this video chapter series, and leave me a comment, let me know you were here, and enjoy as I now turn the page. The Inquisition. Heretics outlawed. The saddest side of the devil's history appears in the persecution of those who were supposed to be adherents of the devil, namely sectarians, heretics, and witches. The most ridiculous accusations were made and believed of the Manichees, the Montanists, the Novatian Puritans or Cathari, the Albigenses, and other dissenters. They were said to worship the devil by most obscene ceremonies, and their intercourse with him was described most minutely as indecent and outrageous. In times of a general belief in witchcraft and the devil's power, nobody was safe against the accusation of being in the service of Satan. Thus the Stedingers, having effectually resisted the Bishop of Bremen when he tried to take their tithes from them by force of arms, were vanquished and cruelly slaughtered after having been denounced as devil worshippers. The Order of the Templars, the richest and most powerful and even the most orthodox order of Christianity, was accused of the meanest and most bestial idolatry simply because an avaricious king of France was anxious to deprive them of their wealth and valuable possessions. And innumerable private citizens, poor people as a rule recklessly, and rich people deliberately, were made in some way or other victims of this most shameful superstition, sometimes to benefit ecclesiasticism, sometimes to serve the interests of the powerful, sometimes out of sheer ignorance, and sometimes even with the purest and sincerest intentions of doing the right thing for the best of mankind, and with the pious desire of obeying the word of the Lord. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. From Exodus chapter 12, verse 18. The witch prosecution mania was a general and a common disease of the age. On the one hand, it cannot, as is often supposed, be attributed to the influence of the church alone, and it would, on the other hand, be a grave mistake to absolve the ecclesiastical institutions of the fearful crimes of this superstition. For the highest authorities of both Catholic and Protestant Christianity not only upheld the idea of witch prosecution, but enforced it in the execution of law in all of its terrible consequences. It was natural that heretics should always be regarded as belonging to the same category as witches and wizards, for they too were, according to the logic of ecclesiastical reasoning, worshippers of Satan. Deuteronomy commands that prophets and dreamers of dreams, who by signs or wonders that come to pass would persuade Israelites to obey other gods, shall be put to death. From chapter 13, verse 5 through 11, we read, If thy brother, thy son, or thy mother, or thy son, or thy daughter, or the wife of thy bosom, or thy friend, which is as thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, Let us go and serve other gods, which thou hast not known, thou nor thy fathers, namely of the gods of the people which are around about you, nigh unto thee, or far off from thee, from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth, thou shalt not consent unto him, nor hearken unto him, neither shall thine eye pity him, neither shalt thou spare, neither shalt thou conceal him, but thou shalt surely kill him. Thine hand shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. And thou shalt stone him with stones that he die, because he has sought to trust thee away from the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. and all Israel shall hear and fear, and shall do no more any such wickedness as this is among you." End quote. Relying on this passage, Saint Jerome, who lived from 340 to 420 AD, did not hesitate to advise the infliction of capital punishment upon heretics, and Leo the Great, Pope from 440 to 461 AD, takes the same view. Priscillian, a bishop of Spain, a man of learning and pure morals, was the first heretic who was put to torture and, together with some of his adherents, decapitated at Treves in the year 385. The followers of Priscillian revered the memory of their teacher as that of a martyr, and formed a sect which continued to exist for a long time, in spite of the excommunication of the Church. Pope Leo the Great justified and praised the condemnation of Priscillian. Under Pope Alexander III, the title Inquisitor, in the sense of judge in matters of faith, was used for the first time at the Council of Tours in 1163. The Synod of Verona in 1184 cursed all heretics and ordered them, in case they relapsed, to be handed over to the secular authorities for capital punishment. Pope Innocent III, from 1198 to 1126, for the sake of crushing the Albigenses, gave power to papal emissaries to sue the heretics and enjoined all bishops on penalty of deposition to assist in the discovery and prosecution of unbelievers. Following in the footsteps of Gregory VII, he vindicated the supremacy of the Church over the state. He humiliated Philip Augustus of France, deposed Emperor Otto IV, compelled John of England to acknowledge the feudal sovereignty of the Pope and pay tribute. He instigated the Fourth Crusade from 1202 to 1204 and exterminated the Albigenses. Under his papacy, at the suggestion of Castilian Dominic and the Bishop of Toulouse, the new order of Dominicans was instituted, which was destined to become the working force of the Inquisition. Pope Gregory IX pursued the traditional policy with great vigor, establishing a regular inquisitorial office for Italy under the name of the Holy Office in 1224. Gregory's policy was codified in an instrument of 45 articles by the Council of Toulouse in 1229, and thus the Inquisition became an established church institution, the appointment and superintendence of which formed an important prerogative of the Pope. It was not until this period that the Pope became the absolute ruler of the Church, for now even bishops could be cited before the papal tribunal of the Inquisition. Gregory IX appointed in 1232 the Dominicans as papal inquisitors, who performed the terrible duties of their office so faithfully that they truly earned the title of Dominicanes, the sleuthhounds of the Lord, which originated in a wordplay on their name. A famous fresco in the Santa Maria Novella at Florence, entitled Dominicanes, painted by Simone Memmi, represents the inquisitorial idea under the allegory of a pack of hounds chasing off the wolves from the sheepfold. Gregory IX, 1227 through 1241, sent Conrad of Marburg to Germany and gave him unlimited power of citing before his tribunal all people suspected of witchcraft, commanding him to bring the guilty to the faggot. And this fiendish man obeyed with joy his master, whom he revered as the vicar of Christ on earth. He encountered much opposition, for the people became rebellious, and even the archbishops of Cologne, Treves, and Mayence attempted to resist him. But Conrad remained firm. His practices had the unequivocal sanction of His Holiness the Pope, and he did not hesitate to begin proceedings even against these three highest dignitaries of the Church in Germany. Wherever Conrad appeared, the faggots were lit, and many innocent people became the victims of his fanaticism. The Archbishop of Mayence, bent on stopping this fiend, wrote a letter to the Pope in which he said, quote, "Whoever fell into his hands had only the choice between a ready confession for the sake of saving his life and a denial, whereupon he was speedily burnt. Every false witness was accepted, but no just defense granted, not even to people of prominence. The person arraigned had to confess that he was a heretic, that he had touched a toad, that he had kissed a pale man, or some monster. Many Catholics suffered themselves to be burnt innocently rather than confess to such vicious crimes, of which they knew they were not guilty. The weak ones, in order to save their lives, lied about themselves and other people, especially about such prominent ones whose names were suggested to them by Conrad. Thus brothers accused their brothers, wives their husbands, servants their masters. Many gave money to the clergy for good advice as to how to protect themselves, and the greatest confusion originated. Alberici Monaci, 1233. The Archbishop's letter failed to impress His Holiness and did not in the least change the course of things. On the contrary, Rome pursued more vigorously than ever its old policy, which was at last definitely formulated by Paul Urban V in his bull In Coena Domini, proclaimed in 1362, which sounded the slogan against all who ventured to dissent from Rome and solemnly condemned heresy in strong and unequivocal terms. Meanwhile, the success of the Inquisition had been greatly imperiled by the opposition which Conrad of Marburg encountered in Germany, when the Inquisitor General indicted Count Henry of Seine for heresy. He was cited before the German Diet that was held in Mayence. The Diet was not inclined to respect Conrad's authority and passed a vote of censure. Bent on vengeance for the insult received, the Inquisitor left for Paderborn, but before he could do further mischief, he was overtaken by several noblemen on the 30th of July, 1233, near Marburg on the Lahn, and slain. Thus he fell a martyr to his bloody profession. Footnote: see Conrad von Marburg by Henke, and another work of the same title by Beck, Breslau, 1861. Conrad was the father confessor of Elizabeth, the widow of the Landgrave of Thuringia. The poor woman submitted to most indecent corporal punishments and was sainted as a reward. If the same events happened today, both the Landgravine and her father confessor would probably have been transferred from the Warburg to an insane asylum. It is scarcely credible, but nevertheless true, that a book appeared in defense of Conrad as an inquisitor and of his fiendish deeds by Kaltner under the title Conrad von Marburg und die Inquisition in Deutschland, in Prague, 1882. End of footnote. The Germans breathed more freely, but Gregory IX canonized him as a saint and martyr and ordered that a chapel be built on the spot on which he was killed. While the establishment of the Holy Office in Germany met with serious difficulties, the inquisitors were welcomed in France by Louis the Pious, Philip the Fair, and Charles IV. The inquisitor Hugo de Vignoles had a number of prominent people burned alive at Toulouse in 1275, among them Angèle, Lady of Labarthe, a woman of 65 years accused of sexual intercourse with Satan. It is stated that she had borne a monster with a wolf's head and a serpent's tail, whose sole food consisted of babies. Under the rule of Charles IV, the ill-famed Bastille was built because the prisons no longer sufficed to hold the indicted heretics. The reign of Charles VI is distinguished by a temporary lull in the witchcraft prosecution in France, mainly due to the weakness of the papacy arising from the great schism between Rome and Avignon. The curses which the two popes mutually visited on their adherents appear to change into blessings. The Synod of Langres, 1404, speaks of soothsayers as impostors and holds out to those who are in the power of Satan the hope of salvation through repentance and penance. The Tribunal of Toulouse, 1606, enacted no other punishment upon 13 persons than fines, fasts, pilgrimages, and almsgiving, while the inquisitor was tried and convicted for the misappropriation of confiscated property. King Charles VI ordered that he be deprived of his salary. In Spain, the Inquisition prospered best. The Directorium Inquisitorum of N. Aymeric, Rome, 1587, the Inquisitor General for Castile, affords us a complete insight into the proceedings of the Holy Office, its spy system, its modes of cross-examination and torture, and its spoils. Turkmeda and Ximenes were the most determined and unrelenting successors of Aymeric. The wealthiest, the most powerful, the most learned were threatened alike, and even Archbishop Carranza, the primate of the Church of Spain, could not escape the prosecution of the inquisitors. In the beginning of the 15th century, Johann Schneider, a German and Dominican monk, published a book on witches and their deceptions. At the same time, Pope Eugene IV, from 1431 to 1447, encouraged the inquisitors in a circular letter to proceed with severity, quote, summarily, without ado, and without any judiciary form, end quote. The prior of Saint Germain, William von Edelin, who had preached against the reality of witchcraft, had to beg pardon publicly in the Episcopal Chapel at Evreux on September 12, 1453, and to confess that he himself had worshipped Satan, had renounced his faith in the cross, and preached that witchcraft was an illusion at the especial command of the devil for the propagation of the satanic dominion. Adelin remained incarcerated and was soon released from further persecution by death. In 1458, J. Nicolaus Jacares appeared in the field with another publication called the Heretic's Gorge, or Flagellum Hereticorium Passionorium, Frankfurt, 1581, in which Adelin's case is reported as one argument among many others for the reality of witchcraft. And now, at last, all opposition of the practices of witch prosecutors were put down. The Inquisitor Pierre Labroussard, member of the Dominican order, cited during the absence of Bishop of Arras a number of persons before his tribunal and made them confess on the rack that they had been with the Waldenses. He promised to spare their lives if they agreed publicly to confess all the abominable crimes of which the Waldenses had been accused. At a public meeting, the accused persons appeared on a scaffold. They wore caps exhibiting pictures of devil worship. The various ceremonies of obscene demonolatry were read to them, and they were asked whether they were guilty. All the accused affirmed their guilt, whereupon, in utter neglect of previous promises, they were sentenced and turned over to the secular authorities to be burned alive. In vain did they now shout that they had been cheated, that they knew nothing of the crimes of which they had been accused, and that they had only confessed because they had been promised to be left off with a nominal punishment. Broussard was determined to set an example, and had them executed in 1560 in spite of the protestations of their innocence. The witch hammer. Witch prosecutions received a new impulse in the year 1484 through the bull of Pope Innocent VIII, beginning with the words Summis Desiderantes Affectivus. The inquisitors of Germany, Heinrich and Stidorus, whose German name was Kramer, and Jacob Spranger, complained of having met with resistance while attending to their duties, and the Pope afforded them the desired assistance for the sake of strengthening the Catholic faith and of preventing the horrible crimes and excesses of witchcraft. The bull of Pope Innocent VIII had reference to Germany only, but other popes, Alexander VI, Julius II, Leo X, and Hadrian IV, issued bulls written in the same spirit, instigating the seal of the inquisitors to do their best for the purification of the faith and the suppression of witchcraft. The heinous bull of Pope Innocent VIII was the immediate cause of the writing of the Malleus Maleficarum, or witch hammer, which received the sanction of the Pope and a patent from Emperor Maximilian. With the witchcraft in hand, Sprenger and Institoris appeared in 1487 before the Theological Faculty of Cologne and demanded their approbation, which was given with reluctance and after a long hesitation. The original form of the document is very guarded and approves of the principles of punishing witchcraft only insofar as they do not contradict the sacred canons. This did not appear sufficient, and the inquisitors insisted upon a more decisive verdict. There are 4 further articles which contain an unequivocal request to the secular authorities to assist the Inquisition in the interest of the Catholic faith. In addition, the inquisitors secured a notary's certificate concerning the emperor's patent and the approbation of the theological faculty. But it is noteworthy that the emperor's patent is not literally reproduced, nor has it, according to Soldan's opinion, ever been published. The notary declares merely that the emperor promises to protect the papal bull and to assist both inquisitors. Such is the first introduction of the witch hammer in Germany, and the book was at once recognized by zealots as the main source of information on witchcraft. Damhuter, the great criminalist of the 16th century, esteemed its authority as almost equal to the law, and its baneful influence extends over a period of 3 centuries. Its style is poor, its ideas are foolish, its intentions are villainous, and the advice given to the inquisitors concerning their procedure betrays a diabolical perfidiousness. The book contains the most confounded nonsense, often self-contradictory, and is throughout irrational and superstitious. The witch hammer advises beginning the trial with the question whether or not the person on trial believes in witchcraft. The statement is added, "Mind that witches generally deny the question." If the culprit denies, the inquisitor continues, well then, whenever witches are burnt, they are innocently condemned. A denial of witchcraft sealed the doom of the accused at once, for the witch hammer declares, the greatest heresy is not to believe in witchcraft. However, if the accused affirmed the question, the torturers made him confess all that he knew about it and whether or not he had learned and practiced the black art. To plead ignorance would not avail, for the very refusal of a confession was counted a crime under the name maleficium taciturnitatis. There was no escape, and the best course for the victim on the rack was to confess all at once without a relapse into denials, for that at least abbreviated the procedure and ended the tragedy without its incidental terrors. As a rule, the prisoners of the Inquisition ask for death as a boon and, wherever possible, commit suicide. For torture made of everyone a hopeless cripple unfit for either work or enjoyment of life, even though he might be released. Acquittals, however, were rare, and the witch hammer advises the inquisitors never to acquit, but only temporarily to stop proceedings. A noli pros was recommended as the safer way. The culprit should be handed over to the secular authorities for capital punishment, especially if the sentence of being burned alive was mitigated to decapitation, a penalty which the Church avoided inflicting, for the Church thirsts not for blood. A confessor and even the judge himself is advised to speak in private with the prisoner and upon the promise of pardon and mercy to extort a confession. The witch hammer suggests that the judge may say, "If you confess, I shall not condemn you to death," for he may at any time call in another judge to take his place who is at liberty to pronounce the sentence. The victims of the Inquisition were practically without any assistance, for witchcraft was regarded as an exceptional crime, for which the usual rules of procedure were not binding. It belonged before the secular and also the ecclesiastical tribunal. The culprit must be dealt with according to the maxim of Pope Boniface VIII from 1294 to 1303, simply and squarely, without the noise and form of lawyers and judges. To us, who live in an age of calmer thought and more exact investigation, it is difficult to understand how the witch hammer could ever have been believed. The torture. Witch prosecution appears to us as rascality pure and simple, but it was not. It was the result of a firm and deep-seated religious conviction, as may be learned from the Antipholus Maleficorum, a work of John Trithemius, abbot of the monastery of Spongheim, 1442 through 1516, who at the request of Joachim, Margrave of Brandenburg, investigated the subject, and after years of conscientious study presented to the world his view in a book of 4 volumes, which was completed October 16th in the year 1508, when the pious abbot had reached the mature age of 66 years. Trithemius distinguishes 4 classes of wizards and witches. 1. Those who hurt and kill others through poison and other natural means. 2. Those who injure others by the art of magic formulas. 3. Those who converse with the devil personally. 4. Those who have actually concluded a contract with the devil and have thus procured his assistance for evil designs. Trithemius believes that there is no other way of protecting the Commonwealth against the obnoxious influence of these malefactors than by extirpating them, but best by burning them alive. He says, quote, "It is to be lamented that the number of witches in all countries is very great, for indeed there is not a village, be it ever so small, which does not harbor at least one of the 3rd and of the 4th class. But how rare are the judges who punish these crimes against God and nature." End quote. And in another passage, the abbot utters the complaint, quote, "Men and animals die through the infamy of these women, and none considers that it is due to the malignity of witchcraft. There are many who suffer from serious diseases and do not even know that they are bewitched." End of quote. The great dangers of witchcraft seemed to demand extraordinary means for combating its evils, and thus the torture, which had formerly been applied only in exceptional and special cases, began to be developed in a most formidable and barbaric way. Suspected persons were subjected to fire and water ordeals, but the latter test was preferred, and this is the reason, as we read in Koenig's work on the subject. Quote, "A case is known in which the accused person successfully passed through the fire ordeal. It happened immediately before the appearance of the witch hammer. In the archives of Donau Eskingen, there is a document according to which a certain Anne Henny from Rottenbach in the Black Forest in 1485 cleared herself of the suspicion of witchcraft by carrying a hot iron. Concerning the water ordeal, the same author says, "The water ordeal is very cold. Ludwig the Pious abolished it, but Hincmar of Reims defended its practice. In the times of Berhard of Clairvaux, it was used against Manichees. Pope Innocent III again abolished it in the Lateran Council 1215. The famous law book, The Saxon Mirror, written by Eike von Repkau in the year 1230, provides that if 2 men laid claim to the same thing and the neighbors can bear no witness, the water ordeal shall decide." The Mirror of the Swabians, also the 13th century, contains the same proposition. In the 16th century, the practice was almost universally established. As to the underlying idea, Koenig says, quote, "There are opposite views applied to the ordeal of water. According to the one, the question was how long the accused could remain underwater. According to the other, the innocence of the accused was proved by sinking, the guilt by swimming. In both cases, the view prevailed that witches possessed a specific levity, and the rule was adopted that the water refused to receive in its depths those who had shaken off the baptismal water through a renunciation of their faith." End quote. Who can contemplate without indignation and holy wrath the instruments of torture used by inquisitors in their infamous vocation? There are thumbscrews, there are blacksmith tongs and pincers to tear out the fingernails or to be used red hot for pinching. There is the rack, Spanish boots, collars, chains, etc. There are boards and rollers covered with sharp spikes. There is the scavenger's daughter, also the Iron Virgin, a hollow instrument the size and figure of a woman with knives inside, which are so arranged that when closing, the victim would be lacerated in its deadly embrace. Incredible ingenuity was displayed in the invention of these instruments of torture, and one of the executioner's swords, which still hangs in the torturer's vault at Nuremberg on the left side of the entrance, exhibits, in bad Latin, the blasphemous inscription, Solo Deo Gloria. The hangmen took pride in their profession and regarded themselves as disgraced if they could not make their victims confess whatever the inquisitors wanted. Their unusual threat when a heretic, a wizard, or a witch was handed over to them was, "You will be tortured until you are so thin that the sun will shine through you." The instruments look horrible enough, but the practice was more horrible than the wildest imagination can depict. Before the torture began, the accused were forced to drink the witch broth, a disgusting concoction mixed with the ashes of burnt witches and supposed to protect the torturers against the evil influence of witchcraft. The filth of the dungeons was a very effective means of making the prisoner despondent and preparing him for any confession upon which he could be condemned. He was frequently secured by iron manacles fixed in the wall or placed under heavy timbers which prevented the free use of his limbs, rendering him a helpless prey to rats, mice, and vermin of all sorts. Consider only the fiendish details of the torture applied to a woman in the year 1631 on the first day of her trial. 1. The hangman binds the woman who was pregnant and places her on the rack. Then he racked her till her heart would fain break, but had no compassion. 2. When she did not confess, the torture was repeated. The hangman tied her hands, cut off her hair, poured brandy over her head and burned it. 3. He placed sulfur in her armpits and burned it. 4. Her hands were tied behind her, and she was hauled up to the ceiling and suddenly dropped down. 5. This hauling up and dropping down was repeated for some hours until the hangman and his helpers went to dinner. 6. When they returned, the master hangman tied her feet and hands upon her back. 7. Brandy was poured on her back and burned. 8. Then heavy weights were placed on her back and she was pulled up. 9. After this, she was again stretched on the rack. 10. A spike board is placed on her back and she is again hauled up to the ceiling. 11. The master again ties her feet and hangs on them a block of 50 pounds, which makes her think that her heart will burst. 12. This proved insufficient, therefore the master unties her feet and fixes her legs in a vice, tightening the jaws until the blood oozes out of the toes. 13. Nor was this sufficient, therefore she was stretched and pinched again in various ways. 14. Now the hangman of Disagrecker began the third grade of torture. When he placed her on the bench and put the shirt on her, he said, "I do not take you for 1, 2, 3, not for 8 days, nor for weeks, but for half a year or a year, for your whole life until you confess. And if you will not confess, I shall torture you to death, and you shall be burned after all." 15. The hangman's son-in-law hauled her up to the ceiling by her hands. 16. The hangman Dresigacker whipped her with a horsewhip. 17. she was placed in a vice where she remained for 6 hours. 18. After that, she was again mercilessly horsewhipped. This was all that was done on the first day. This is not barbarous. This is not bestial. It is satanic. And such deeds could be done in the name of God, for the sake of the religion of Jesus, and by the command of the highest authorities of the Christian Church? From the great number of prosecutions for witchcraft, we select one instance only, which, however, is neither typical nor extraordinary in its horrors. We read in Koenig's Popular Exposition of Human Superstitions, page 240, quote, "There was a farmer by the name of Veit living in a village of southern Bohemia. He was famous for his wit and unusual humor. At the same time, he was physically strong, and whenever there was a quarrel at the inn, he came off victor. The rumor spread that he was inviolable, as sometimes hunters are supposed to be bulletproof, and Veit never denied it. By and by, he was regarded as a wizard, and as his cattle prospered best and his fields yielded the richest crops, he was soon supposed to be in league with the evil one. Now it happened that the village was troubled with mice, and Veit was suspected of having caused the plague. When questioned about it, he granted in a moment of humor that he had sent the mice but would soon drive them away again, and he promised to prove at the next church fair that he could actually make mice. When the day appointed came, the inn was overcrowded, and Farmer Veit appeared with a big bag under his arm, into which he requested the company to throw 20 pebbles. They did so without noticing that the bag was double, and while one part was empty, the other contained 20 mice. When the pebbles were put in the bag, Veit murmured a magic formula and let the mice loose in the presence of his frightened audience. This performance, however, had unexpected and tragic results. The people were convinced that it was the work of hell, and Veit escaped with difficulty from the inn. Veit was arrested at the next night and delivered to the criminal court. A mole on his body was thought to be a stigma of the devil, and all the witnesses agreed that he was a genuine wizard. His case was thoroughly investigated, and even the University of Prague was consulted. The verdict, signed by the Rector Magnificus with his own hand, was against him, and Veit, who stoutly maintained his innocence, had to endure all the tortures of the Inquisition. At last he was burned alive, and the ashes of his body were thrown to the winds. We read in the records of the lawsuit that Veit mounted the stake without showing repentance or doing penance, and when chains were put on his back, around his body, and around his feet, he cried with a loud voice, "My God, I die innocently." Judges, professors, physicians, and theologians agreed unanimously in the conviction of this innocent man. End quote. Volumes might be filled with accounts of the many thousand various instances of witch prosecutions, and every single case is so soul-harrowing that we prefer to pass them by in silence. The accusations are almost always by circumstantial and definite, mostly of brutal indecency and ridiculously impossible. The Angel of Augsburg. Witch prosecution was a convenient weapon in the hands of unscrupulous men for accomplishing crooked ends or satisfying some private vengeance. One of the most tragic and pathetic cases is the sad death of Agnes Bernauer, a beautiful woman, the daughter of a barber and the sweetheart of Albrecht, Duke of Bavaria. Agnes was born about 1410 in Bilberach, and it appears that she was a mere servant girl in Augsburg at the time Duke Albrecht of Wittenberg, the son of Duke Ernst, made her acquaintance. The story that Agnes was a patrician birth and that the lovers met at the great tournament is mere legend, but this much is sure, that Agnes was extraordinarily beautiful, with golden hair and delicate, noble features. Even her enemies could not help praising the nobility of her appearance. We know little or nothing about the relations between Duke Albrecht and Agnes, except that he courted her and took her with him to his residence in the county Bamberg. Duke Ernest, Albrecht's father, knew about Agnes' presence at Bamberg, but he cared little until he became anxious about having a legal heir to his duchy. Then he requested his son to marry the daughter of Duke Eric of Brunswick, but Albrecht refused on account of the love he bore to Agnes. When persuasion appeared to be without avail, Duke Ernest thought of other means to separate his son from the lowly-born maiden. At a public tournament, he ordered the judges to refuse admittance to Albrecht on the ground that for the sake of a concubine he neglected his filial duties. Albrecht was greatly exasperated, and as soon as he returned to Bamberg, he recognized Agnes as his wife. With the consent of his uncle, Duke William, he moved to the Castle Strobing, which he donated to her, and surrounding her with a ducal court, called her henceforth Duchess Agnes. The poor woman did not enjoy the splendor of the court. She feared the wrath of the old duke, and built, in a melancholy presentiment of her sad fate, her own burial chapel in the monastery of the Carmelites at Strobing. Her happiness was of short duration. In Albrecht's absence, Duke Ernest seized Agnes, had her imprisoned, and denounced her as a witch. Her condemnation had been decided upon before the trial began, and the verdict pronounced her guilty of having bewitched Duke Albrecht and thus committed a criminal offense against Duke Ernest. The judgment ordered her to be drowned in the river, and Duke Ernest signed the verdict. The hangman carried the young woman to the bridge at Strobing and thrust her, in the presence of the multitude of spectators, into the water. But the current drifted her ashore, and she held up her white arms, appealing to the people for help. The people were moved, and she might have been saved had not one of the hangmen, fearing the wrath of the old duke, seized a pole and, catching her long golden hair, held her under water until she expired. This happened in the year 1435. She was buried in St. Peter's Cemetery of Strobing. When the young duke on his return was informed of the terrible death of his beloved Agnes, he swore vengeance, and in alliance with his cousin Duke Ludwig of Bavaria Ingolstadt, began to wage a vigorous war against his own father. Through the mediation of the emperor, however, he was reconciled with his father at the Council of Basel. Duke Ernest built a chapel over the grave of his innocent victim, and had an annual mass read over her for the welfare of her soul. Duke Albrecht thereupon agreed to marry Anna, Princess of Brunswick, by whom he had 10 children, although it cannot be said that his married life was a happy one. In 1447, Duke Albrecht had the body of Agnes transferred to the chapel which she had built for herself in the Carmelite monastery, and he had the resting place of her remains adorned with a beautiful marble image of her in full figure with the simple inscription, Obi Agnes Benauden, requiescat in pace. Poets who have immortalized her name, and the people of Bavaria, among whom her memory is still cherished, call her the Angel of Augsburg. One of the most comical witch prosecutions took place in 1474 against a diabolical rooster who had been so presumptuous as to lay an egg. The poor creature was solemnly tried, whereupon he was condemned to die at the stake and publicly burned by order of the authorities of the good city of Basel. We abstain from entering further into the details of the prosecution of witches, which gradually developed into a systematic business involving great emoluments to judges, torturers, hangmen, inquisitors, denouncers, witnesses, and all persons connected with the process. It is a doleful work to go over the mere statistics of the autos da fe, and every single story of a trial for witchcraft cannot but rouse our deepest indignation. And even now, the belief in witchcraft is not yet extinct among the so-called civilized races of mankind. The Age of Reformation. The Reformation, although in many respects a great advance, did not introduce a sudden change in the belief in the devil. Nevertheless, the tendency becomes more and more apparent to interpret Satan in psychological terms, and instead of expecting him in the horrors of nature or in the objective reality of our surroundings, to find him in our own hearts, where he appears as temptation in all forms, as allurement, ambition, vanity, as the vain pursuit of fortune, power, and worldly pleasures. Christianity was split up into two parties: the conservatives, who remained faithful to Rome's spiritual supremacy, and the progressive Protestants, who opposed the traditional authorities of the Church and clamored for reform in the various ways of life. Restless times of this kind are favorable for satire and sarcasm, and the devil therefore naturally played an important part in the polemics on either side. At the same time, the moral earnestness of the reformers forced the authorities of the Church to abandon many of the worst misuses, and thus the reform of the Reformation did not remain limited to the Reformed churches, but extended its blessings to the Roman Church itself. The anti-Reformation, whose backbone was the Jesuits, was a most serious and rigorously pure movement born of deep religious piety. But it was darkened in its very start by mysticism verging on coarse superstition, and lacked that love of freedom, of progress, of scientific investigation, and the desire to learn the truth which characterizes the exponents of Protestantism. It is noticeable, however, that the moral element is pushed into the foreground, and both parties begin to agree in this, that morality is the ultimate test of religion. The idea of conceiving Satan as sin and temptation is not new. Think only of the illustrations in the Hortus Delicarum, but the conception of sin and temptation begins now to be better understood as a psychological condition of subjective states. Luther. Luther was, in his demonology, a real child of his time. He saw the devil everywhere. He struggled with him constantly and overcame him by his confidence in God. He regarded the Pope as an incarnation of Satan, or as the Antichrist, and the Roman Church as the kingdom of the devil. He sang of him, quote, "And were this world with devils filled that threatened to undo us, we will not fear that God had willed his truth to triumph through us. Our ancient vicious foe still seeks to work his woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal. The prince of this world his banner has unfurled, and yet he will harm none, for he is all undone. One little word defeats him." End quote. The devil was to Luther a real, living power, a concrete personality, and he used to characterize him as the good Lord's hangman and the instrument of his anger and punishment. God needs the devil for a servant and utilizes his malignity for the procreation of the good. Luther's belief in the devil was not only very realistic, but also almost childishly ingenious. When at work, he was prepared for his incessant interference, and when going to rest, he expected to be disturbed by him. Luther was not afraid of him, yet the efforts he made in conquering the evil one are sufficient evidence that he regarded him as very powerful. He protested he would go to worms through every tile on the roofs of the city were a devil. He saw the fiend grinning at him while he translated the Bible, and he threw his inkstand at his satanic majesty. By and by, the familiarity between Luther and the devil increased. Early this morning, Luther tells us in his Tixkreden, "When I awoke, the fiend came and began disputing with me. 'Thou art a great sinner,' said he. I replied, 'Canst not tell me something new, Satan?'" Luther was inclined to believe in the devil's power of assisting wizards and witches in their evil designs. Following St. Augustine's authority, he conceded the possibility of incubi and succubi, because Satan, in the shape of a handsome young man, loves to decoy young girls. He also accepted the superstition of changelings and declared that witches should suffer death. But when once confronted with a real case, he insisted, when his counsel was sought, on the most scrupulous circumspection. He wrote to the judge, "I request you to explore everything with exactness so as to leave no trace of fraud. For I have experienced so many deceits, frauds, artifices, lies, treacheries, etc., that I can scarcely make up my mind to believe. Therefore, see and convince yourself to your own satisfaction, lest you be mistaken and I may be mistaken through you." Although it is true that Luther's views of the devil were as childish as those of his contemporaries, it would be rash to denounce the Reformation for having accomplished no progress and having done nothing to suppress the barbarous superstitions of demonology. Luther's God conception was purer and nobler than the God conception of the leading churchmen and popes of his time, and thus his faith, in spite of his crudities, led, after all, to purer conceptions which were destined gradually to overcome the old traditional dualism. Luther demanded that Christ should not only be recognized as the Savior of mankind, but that every man should be able to say, "He has come to save me personally and individually." Luther thus carried the religious life into the very hearts of men and declared that there was no salvation in ceremonies, absolutions, or sacraments unless one had individually, in one's own nature and being, vanquished the temptations of Satan. The most dangerous idols are, according to Luther, the pulpit and the altar, for sacraments and ceremonies cannot save. They are symbols instituted to assist us. Those who believe that ceremonies possess any power of their own are still under the influence of the pagan notion that evils can be averted by sacrifices and exorcisms. Luther's successors. While Luther instinctively abhorred persecutions of any kind, he still retained those beliefs which were the ultimate cause of which persecution. We must therefore not be astonished to see even in Protestant countries a revival of the horrors which had been inaugurated by the Inquisition. The most curious work of Protestant demonology is the Theatrum Diabolorum by Sigmund Feyerabend, a voluminous collection of the orthodox views of Luther's followers concerning the existence, power, nature, and demeanor of devils. Luther's belief in the devil was crude, but he was even here morally great, strong in his religious sentiment, and serious in his demand that everyone personally should honestly wage a war with the powers of evil, and that no church, no intercession of saints, no formulas or rituals had saving power. Luther's followers retain all the crudities of their master and to some extent his moral seriousness, but they fall below the manliness of his spirit. Feyerabend's Theatrum Diabolorum, which, as the title says, is a useful and sensible book, contains a great number of essays written by such prominent little authorities as Jodocus Hocarus, Osnaburgensis, Hermanus Hamelimanus, Andreas Musculus, Andreas Fabricius Caminensis, Ludovicus Melicius, and others. The Reverend Hocker explained in 48 chapters almost all possible problems connected with devils, whose number in chapter 8 is, according to Varahus, calculated to be not less than, a figure almost impossible to say, 2, 6, 6, 5, 8, 6, 6, 7, 4, 6, 6, 6, 4. Others describe special kinds of devils, such as the devil of blasphemy, the dance devil, the servant's devil, the hunting devil, the drink devil, the wedlock devil, the devil of unchastity, the miser's devil, the devil of tyranny, the laziness devil, the pride devil, the pantaloon devil, the gambling devil, the courtier's devil, represented in a drama of 5 cats, the scene of the court of Darius, and the pestilence devil. The author of this last chapter, the Reverend Herman Strack, concludes by saying, "When we can obtain medicine, let us not have a contempt for God's valuable gifts, but withal let us always and all the time rest our confidence and main comfort upon the only God." The same conception of the devil is presented with somewhat more poetical skill by Jacob Roofs, who dramatized the story of Job and the parable of the vineyard, the latter which was performed at Zurich, Switzerland in 1539, May 26, introduces Satan as he sows the seeds of sedition in the minds of the servants of the vineyard and induces them to slay the son of their master. Almost all these treatises, poor though they may be as literary, theological, or pastoral exhortations, yet show the rationalistic tendency of discovering the devil in the vices of man. And this method became more and more established until in these latter days Satan himself was boldly and directly by Protestant theologians declared to be a mere abstract idea and a personification of evil. Yet this step was not taken at once, and mankind had to pass through a long period of wavering opinions, of conflicting propositions, uncertainties, venomous controversies, and anxious research for the truth. Shakespeare. The Protestant devil became somewhat more cultured than the Catholic devil, for the advancement noticeable in the civilization of Protestant countries extended also to him. Says Mephistopheles in Faust, "Culture which smooth the whole world licks, also unto the devil sticks." To note the progress, let us compare Wintone, who wrote early in the 15th century, and Shakespeare. Wintone's witches are ugly, old hags. Shakespeare's, although by no means beautiful, are yet interesting and poetical. They are so withered and so wild in their attire that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it. It is a poetical fiction representing temptation, and in this same sense, the very word devil is frequently used by Shakespeare. We are told, "'Tis the eye of childhood that fears a painted devil," and one fiend, as we read in Shakespeare, is the invisible spirit of wine. The devil, we read in Hamlet, hath power to assume a pleasing shape. And the meaning of this sentence is plainly psychological, as we learn from another passage in which Polonius says to his daughter, "With devotion's visage and pious action, we do sugar over the devil himself." Milton. The Protestant devil, as a poetical figure, received his finishing touches from Milton, and Milton's devil acquires a nobility of soul, moral strength, independence, and manliness which none of his ancestors possessed. Neither Satan nor Azazel, nor his proud cousins the Egyptian Typhon and the Persian Ahriman. The best characterization of Milton's Satan is given by Taine. He ridicules Milton's description of Adam and Eve, who talk like a married couple of the poet's days. I listen and hear an English household, 2 reasoners of the period, Colonel Hutchinson and his wife. Heavens, dress them! Folks so cultivated should have invented first of all a pair of trousers. The picture of the good Lord is still more severely criticized. He says, "What a contrast between God and Satan." Taine continues, Milton's Jehovah is a grave king who maintains a suitable state, something like Charles I. Goethe's God, half abstraction, half legend, source of calm oracles, a vision just beheld after a pyramid of ecstatic strophes, greatly excels this Miltonic God a businessman, a schoolmaster, a man for show. I honor him too much in giving him these titles. He deserves a worse name. He also talks like a drill sergeant, vanguard to right and left, the front unfold. He makes quips as clumsy as those of Harrison, the former butcher turned officer. What a heaven! It is enough to disgust one with paradise. One would rather enter Charles I's troop of lackeys or Cromwell's Ironsides. We have orders of the day, a hierarchy, exact submission, extra duties, disputes, regulated ceremonials, prostrations, etiquette, furbished arms, arsenals, depots of chariots and ammunition. How different is the abode of Satan, Taine says. The finest thing in connection with this paradise is hell. Dante's hell is but a hall of tortures, whose cells, one below another, descend to the deepest wells. Milton's hell is the asylum of independence. It may be dreary, but it is the home of liberty that scorns abject servility. Milton describes the place as follows. Is this the region, this the soil, the clime, said then the last archangel? This the seat that we must change for heaven? This mournful gloom for that celestial light? Be it so, since he, who now is sovereign, can dispose and bid what shall be right. Farthest from him is best, whom reason has equaled, force hath made supreme above his equals. Farewell, happy fields, where joy for ever dwells. Hail, horrors, hail, infernal world, and thou, profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be, all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater? Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath no built here for his envy. He will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition, though in hell, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. It has been frequently remarked that Milton's Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost, and indeed, he appears as the most sympathetic figure in the greatest religious epic of English literature. His pride is not without self-respect, which we cannot help admiring. Satan exclaims, "Is there no place left for repentance? None for pardon left? None left but by submission, and that word disdain forbids me." And how noble appears Milton's Satan. Milton personifies in Satan the spirit of the English Revolution. Milton's Satan represents the honor and independence of the nation asserted in the face of an incapable government. Satan's appearance shows strength and dignity. He above the rest, in shape and gesture, proudly eminent, stood like a tower. And his character is distinguished by love of liberty. Taine describes him as follows. The ridiculous devil of the Middle Ages, a horned enchanter, a dirty jester, a petty and mischievous ape, band leader to a rabble of old women, has become a giant and a hero. Though feebler in force, he remains superior in nobility, since he prefers suffering independence to happy servility, and welcomes his defeat and his torments as a glory, a liberty, and a joy. The devil naturally acquires noble features which make him less diabolical and more divine in the measure that the God conception of an age becomes the embodiment of the conservatism of the ruling classes. When the name and idea of God are misapplied to represent stagnation, Satan might change places with God. A new sect of devil worshippers who aspire for advancement and progress in the name of Satan might have arisen had not Protestantism, decried centuries ago as the work of the devil, gained so much influence that in time it became itself a great conservative power in the world, and that its noble aspirations were first attributed to the influence of the devil is only preserved in verse and fable. The devil in the human heart. The common people in Protestant countries knew nothing of the mighty hero of Paradise Lost. They knew Satan only through the New Testament, and, being little affected by the progress of the natural sciences, took him as seriously as did the early Christians and the Dominicans of the Inquisition. But there is this difference. The spirit of the Reformation rested upon them with both its moral earnestness and its subjectivism. The middle classes, as a rule, did not fall a prey to the aberrations of the former times. They practiced no exorcisms and showed no inclination to prosecute, but confined their endeavors to the salvation of their own souls. The classical productions of the literature of this type are Pilgrim's Progress and The Heart of Man, both highly interesting from a psychological standpoint, for both exhibit the subjective methods of the introspection in high degree, and will, as instances of naive but extraordinary self-observation and analysis, retain a lasting value. While the author of Pilgrim's Progress, his name and the vicissitudes of his life are well known, The Heart of Man appeared anonymously, first in French and then in German. The French original seems to be lost, and with it the date of its first appearance. The first German translation was published in Würzburg in the year 1732, under the title Geistlicher Sittenspiegel. It was reprinted once more in 1815 under the more appropriate title Das Herz des Menschen, exhibiting a series of illustrations which represent the human heart as the battlefield of the powers of good and evil. The first picture shows the human heart in its natural perversity, but the sinner represents in the second picture, and the Holy Ghost takes possession of his soul in the third picture. The fourth picture shows us a contemplation of the sufferings of the Savior, and the Holy Trinity resides in the soul, as is illustrated in the fifth picture. But worldly temptations and prosecutions represented the former by a man with a goblet, and the latter by another man with a dagger, prevail upon the heart and shake its good resolutions, which is seen in the sixth picture, until at last, in the seventh picture, Satan, with 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, re-enters, and the last state of that man is worse than the first. The practical application of this analysis of the human heart is given in 2 illustrations picturing the death of the pious and impious man. The former, whose heart is depicted in the 9th picture, is portrayed in the 10th picture as being called by the Savior to enjoy the eternal bliss of heaven, while the 8th picture exhibits the doom of the latter, who is lost forever in hell. The interesting feature of these illustrations consists in the method of showing the elements of man's soul, his passions, and aspirations as foreign powers which enter, pass out, and re-enter. The heart itself appears as an empty bank, and its character is established by the tendencies which dwell in it. The psychology which lies at the bottom of the author's belief is not clearly pronounced. It may be either the Brahmanical theory of the self as being in itself, or the Buddhist doctrine of the illusoriness of the self, but it appears that the self, as represented in the head above the heart, is a mere reflex of the process that takes place within the human soul, and should therefore be regarded merely as the principle of unity, the moral worth of which depends upon the nature of its elements. The author of these drawings has, in his naive analysis of the human heart, approached a scientific conception of the soul more closely than presumably he was aware of himself. A revival of witch prosecution. At the time of the Reformation, witch prosecution ceased for a while. It made room for another mania not less ugly and condemnable. Its place was filled by heresy persecution. Not only did Roman Catholic governments worry their Protestant subjects almost to death by confiscating their property, chasing them with hounds to mass, exiling entire districts, and ignominiously executing their leaders, but Protestants in their turn, too, regarded it as their religious duty to do the same to all dissenters. Luther himself, be it said to his everlasting honor, did not persecute, and so long as he lived, he succeeded in preventing among his followers all persecutions. Calvin, however, ordered Servetus to be burned alive because his belief in the Trinity differed from his own, and King Henry VIII of England resolutely suppressed with a high hand all opposition to the religious views he had happened to hold at the time. Nor did he shrink from shedding blood, although we must grant that he exercised much judgment by confining his persecution to a comparatively few powerful opponents. While the fear of witchcraft was thus set aside for a time, the dangerous belief in the power of Satan continued and lay hidden like a burning coals under ashes. The religious superstitions remained practically the same, and it is natural that the epidemic reappeared, although in a less virulent form. Even Protestant countries, North Germany, Sweden, England, Scotland, and the English colonies in North America, were visited by this spiritual plague, and a number of lay judges appeared who showed the same zeal as the Dominican inquisitors in Catholic countries. With the waning of the zeal for burning witches, the defenders of witchcraft grew rather more numerous than before. Among them are Dr. Thomas Erastus of Heidelberg and Jean Bodin, a Frenchman, the suffragan bishop Peter Binsfeld, and Justice Nicholas Remigius, defended in voluminous books with new arguments the policy of the witch hammer, and King James I of England wrote a demonology filled with all the superstition of the Middle Ages. Martin del Rio, a Jesuit, deems a revision of the belief in witchcraft in order, but comes to the conclusion that the evil exists and that there is no remedy save the use of relics, holy water, exorcism, and the holy sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church. The National Museum of Germanic Antiquities at Nuremberg possesses a large poster which contains an account of 3 women who were burned as witches at Nuremberg in the year 1555. Although they were not burned on the same day, the illustration represents them as standing on the faggots together, and the statement is made that in one instance, when the fire was lit, Satan appeared and visibly carried away his paramour through the air. The tragedy of Nuremberg is one case only among many. Mayor Faringer of Norlingen swore to exterminate the whole brood of sorcerers, and Judge Benedict Karpovs, Jr., 1595-1666, of Leipzig, following in the footsteps of his father, condemned more than 100 persons to die at the stake for witchcraft. Sensible prelates. The Protestants of the 16th and 17th centuries were on the average perhaps more serious in their religious beliefs than the Roman Catholics of the same period, and thus it happened that some French prelates of the Roman Church, being more worldly wise and more deeply imbued with the advancing spirit of the age than many bigoted Protestants, displayed infinitely more common sense than their brethren of the Reformed churches. This became particularly patent in the famous case of Martha Brosier, a French peasant girl who in 1588 claimed to be possessed of a devil. The excitement was great, and the pulpits resounded with alarming denunciations apt to renew all the terrors of former witch prosecution. But Bishop Myron of Angers and Cardinal de Gondi, Archbishop of Paris, retained their tranquility and had the case investigated not only according to a truly rational method, but even in a spirit of humor. When the never-failing tasks with exorcisms through sacred books and holy water were administered, Bishop Myron so arranged matters that the possessed girl was induced to draw wrong conclusions, and lo, simple spring water and the reading of a line from Virgil regularly brought on epileptic fits, while neither the old reliable exorcisms nor the holy water produced any effect when the girl did not apprehend the sacred texts. Believers in satanic possession were not satisfied with Bishop Myron's experiments, for they regarded them as a proof of the cunning of the devil, who thus slyly deceived his enemies. The case was brought before the Archbishop of de Gondi, but he too proved skeptical and declared after some judicious experiments that the demeanor of the possessed girl was a mixed result of insanity and simulation. Urban grandeur. In spite of the sound judgment shown by these and other prelates, the prosecutions of witches continued. In the case of Urban Grandier, a priest who was accused by the Ursuline nuns of London in western France of having exercised satanic powers upon their minds, the archbishops of Bordeaux recognized the malicious hostility and hysterical bitterness with which the nuns bore witness against their preacher. Grandier was not innocent in other respects, but there were many priests whose morals were no better. Considering the innumerable contradictions in the statements of his enemies, the archbishop dismissed the case, and he was honorably reinstalled in his position. But that was not the end of it. It happened that M.D. Labourdemont, a cousin of the prioress, while attending to some business at the French government in London, heard of the story and gave a highly colored report to Cardinal Richelieu, at whose instance the investigation was renewed. In the second trial, Grandier had no chance, for Labourdemont was appointed judge. He accepted the most ridiculous evidence. The devils who spoke out of the mouths of the obsessed nuns were called upon as witnesses, and two documents were produced which purported to be the original pact of Grandier with Satan. One of them is signed by Grandier. The other bears the signature of 6 devils, the authenticity of which is vouched by Balberith, the secretary of his satanic majesty. The script is in mirror writing. 4 expert doctors of the Sorbonne, although they never doubted either the documents or the reality of the devils of the obsessed nuns, saw fit to caution the judges not to admit the testimony of Satan, because the slanderer and liar could not be a trustworthy witness. But the exorcising fathers, all of whom were Carmelite monks, laid down the principle that a properly exorcised devil cannot help confessing the truth. Grandier was cruelly tortured and executed on August 18. But Peter Lactantius, the chief exorcist whom the dying Grandier had challenged to appear before the tribunal of God, died a raving maniac exactly 1 month after the death of his victim on September 18. A Protestant witch execution. Much has been said and written about the cruelty of the Roman Catholics' methods of witch prosecution, but the Protestants were not a whit better, except perhaps that they added to the proceedings a good deal more of pious cant and accompanied executions with a religious unction which made their conduct the more detestable. As a typical case, we quote an abbreviated report of the execution of 3 witches, Susanna, Ilsa, and their mother Catherine, which took place at Arency, 1687, August 5. Quote, the case was submitted for another revision during which time 6 clergymen attended daily upon the 3 prisoners and exhorted them to pray and sing and repent. Then they were cited before the court one after the other, and the clergymen stood behind them. The president of the court asked them once more, first Susanna, whether she had received an incubus. Answer, yes. Secondly, Ilse, whether her mother had given her an incubus. Answer, yes. And thirdly, Catherine, whether she had given an incubus to Ilse. Answer, yes. Thereupon the notary, Mr. Anton Warnesius, read the judgment, and the executioner went to the court and asked for mercy in case he should not succeed at once in decapitating Susanna and Ilse. The question was asked whether there was any additional grievance. Then the rod was broken, table and chairs of the court upset, and the procession moved out to the Kompenberg, the place of execution. Parts of the guards opened the way. Each one of the 3 witches was accompanied on either side by a clergyman and led with a rope by a hangman. At the same time, 6 armed citizens surrounded her. Another part of the guard closed the procession. On the way, prayers alternated with exhortations and singing of hymns. Before the Seehausen gate, a circle was made, and Susanna was led round until the public had finished singing the hymn, God our Father dwell with us. When her head was taken off, the people sang, To thee we pray, O Holy Ghost. Next came Ilse, who was killed in the same way, accompanied by the singing of the same hymns. While the singing continued, Catherine was placed upon the faggots and her neck fastened with an iron chain, which was drawn so tight that her face swelled and became suffused with a brown color. The faggots were lit, and all present, clergy, school children, and spectators, sang until her body was consumed in the fire. End quote. Witch prosecution in America. Not less terrible fruit than in Europe did the belief in witchcraft bear on the tree soil of Protestant America. Death sentences for witchcraft occurred several times after the foundation of the New England colonies. But the last and most terrible outbreak took place in Salem, Massachusetts, as recorded in Upham's History of Salem Witchcraft and in Drake's Witchcraft Delusion in New England, under the baneful influence of the religious teachings of Increase Mather and his son, Cotton Mather. 2 Boston clergymen, the Reverend Samuel Parris, minister of the church in Salem, began to have a case of witchcraft investigated, which, as says President Andrew Dixon White, would have been the richest of farces had they not led to events so tragical. The possessed behaved like maniacs in court and charged a poor old Indian woman with having bewitched them. Her husband, an ignorant fool, was induced to testify against her. This easy success emboldened the believers in witchcraft, among whom the Putnam family played a prominent part. They began to prosecute some of the foremost people of New England. Several men and women were executed, many fled for their lives, and a reign of terror ensued. Any person once suspected and accused was doomed. As an instance, we quote the case of Mr. Burroughs, a clergyman, who on account of petty parish quarrels with the Putnam family had been dismissed from the ministry. President White says, quote, Mr. Burroughs had led a blameless life, the only thing ever charged against him by the Putnams being that he insisted strenuously that his wife should not go about the parish talking of her own family matters. He was charged with afflicting the children, convicted and executed. At the last moment, he repeated the Lord's Prayer solemnly and fully, which it was supposed no sorcerer could do, and this, together with his straightforward Christian utterances at the execution, shook the faith of many in the reality of diabolical possession. Ere long, it was known that one of the girls had acknowledged that she had belied some persons who had been executed, and especially Mr. Burroughs, and that she had begged forgiveness. But this for a time availed nothing. Persons who would not confess were tied up and put to a sort of torture, which was effective in securing new revelations. In the case of Giles Gorey, the horrors of the persecution culminated. Seeing that his doom was certain, and wishing to preserve his family from attainder and their property from confiscation, he refused to plead. He was therefore pressed to death, and when in his last agonies his tongue was pressed out of his mouth, the sheriff with his walking stick thrust it back again." End quote. Increase and Cotton Mather were the last defenders of diabolical possession and witchcraft on American soil. The latter saw in his later years a new era dawning upon his country. Vigorously and successfully censured Robert Califf, a courageous Boston merchant. He bemoaned the decay of the religious spirit among the growing generation, and even to his dying hour regarded the mere unbelief in witchcraft as an attack upon the glory of the Lord. The present generation may well smile at his mistaken religious notions, but granting him that the old conception of God as a miracle worker and an individual ego being after the fashion of pagan personifications be right, his idea of the importance of a belief in witchcraft is logically correct. If witchcraft is impossible, then there can be no wizard god who changes sticks into serpents, who stops the sun in his course, reverses the shadow of the dial, is jealous of other gods, and of the familiar spirits of witches. The abandonment of the belief in witchcraft tacitly implied the abandonment of a belief in God as a miracle worker, and prepared the way for a nobler religious faith which surrendered the idea of seeking God in the superstitious possibility of breaking the law of nature, and finally found him in the cosmic order itself, in the unity, the harmony, the rightness of those eternal factors of existence which are the conditions of reason, of truth, and of justice. End of chapter. Moving on to the next video, things lighten up a little bit, as the next chapter will be titled The Abolition of Witch Prosecution, as we continue the book titled The History of the Devil and the Idea of Evil from the Earliest Times to the Present Day by Paul Carus. If you haven't done so, please do hit the like button. Let me know you were here. Leave me a comment. Share this with your friends and like-minded people. And yes, subscribe to the channel.